English from India. That was my choice. But I could have chosen, I don't know, an African country, Nigerian literature, South African. But he told me it has to be post colonial. And that is how I started.
So anyway, welcome to whoever's tuned in and who's going to tune in to our program. Today with me we have Cielo Griselda Festino, who is an Argentine professor from based in Brazil. And even before I cautioned her that we were going online, I let a little bit of her talk spill over to this recording because it's so interesting. Her story is so interesting. So Dr. Festino, Dr. Cielo, or we just call you Cielo, whatever it is.
Yeah. So,
Uh, Tell us about. I know you were born in Argentina in this place called Vidia, which is part of the Buenos Aires province. How did you get into working on Indian writing in English?
okay, well, so hi to everybody. So I was born in Vedia, but then my father worked in the countryside. He moved to another province, Cordoba, and from there I moved to Buenos Aires. When I was living in Buenos Aires and it was the time to go to college, it was during the military dictatorship. And I wanted to study Spanish, to tell you the truth, Spanish studies, Spanish literature at Buenos Aires University. But because of the military government, my family was very much afraid. And instead of that, I went to study at Joaquin B. Gonzalez, that was a teacher's training college. And I chose to study English. And there I started my studies in English language and English literature. When I finished my studies, my undergraduate studies, I went to study graduate studies literature. And I studied American literature, North American literature for many years.
This is
And
early 80s, late 80s, or when?
come again.
This is the early 80s or the late 1980s?
This is the late 70s, and
Late
I
70s.
late 70s. I did my undergraduate course, and my graduate studies started in the 80s. And in the 80s, I started studying American literature in Buenos Aires with Susana Mayorga. She was a teacher there. I studied with her for many years and I worked with her and I started teaching at Lenguas Vivas. That is also another teachers training college, like St. Xavier's there in Goa. It's the same sort of institution. And then I came to live in Brazil because my husband came to work here in Brazil. So we moved to Sao Paulo, and when I came to Sao Paulo, I had always studied all my life and taught all my life, and I started studying at University of Sao Paulo. And I did my master's and my PhD here with Lin Mario Menezes de Souza.
That is,
And when
Lin Mario is of Goan origin and based in the University of Sao Paulo.
exactly. So I said, Lin, I want to do my PhD with you. And he said, okay, but you have to do some post-colonial literature. And I say, well, what? Because I was coming from a very traditional English studies, you know. So in Argentina, we had 40 years of English literature, 2 years of American literature, nothing of post colonial literature, geography of the British Isles, history of England, history of United States. But the rest, you know, of the Commonwealth, not a word, you know. Okay. So he said, well, and he brought me a huge suitcase full of books. And he said, well, you choose. And he wanted me to study Go. And I said, Lynn, I don't know anything. You know, I am totally new. So I chose Indian literature in English. And that is how I started. But for that, I had been studying post structuralism and post colonial theory for a long time.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. No, it's fine. Carry on, carry on. I'm just highlighting you.
Okay, sure, no problem. So that is what I did. And then I had to choose one topic for my PhD thesis. And I started reading Indian writers, Indian novelists. And then I worked with Arundhati Roy. You know, she's one of the chapters on my PhD thesis, you know. And well, and that's it. So this is how I got into Indian literature in English.
That's very interesting. Who are the writers in Indian writing that you look up to and you're keeping track of now?
Nowadays, I very much like Rohinton Mystery. I follow his publications. I think he's one of the most interesting Indian writers in English. Everything by Arundhati Roy. When she published the last novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Of course, I read it, so I keep track of them. Also, I like very much Jhumpa Lahiri, that is an Indian who lives in the States, although she's not considered exactly like an Indian writer in English. Of course, I very much like Anita Desai. I have read almost everything by her. And of course, Salman Rushdie also, I have read all of his works. So I am always keeping track of the latest Indian writers who write in English. And lately, of course, I am concerned or focused mainly on Goan literature.
Sorry, you must be one
No,
of the very rare persons who is following Indian writing at such a deep level in Latin America.
no, no. In fact, there are many people who do that. In fact, in Latin America, I think there are many, many people, many scholars, many, I don't know, PhD students who are writing their thesis on Indian literature in English. Here there is, here at USP, there are some professors that actually teach Indian writers in their undergraduate courses too. Lynn Mario is one of them.
I see. I see. That's very interesting. As far as your involvement in Brazil goes, how different is Brazilian approaches to India from, say, Argentinian?
Well, look, whatever I know about Brazil, about India, I learned it here in Brazil because, as I was telling you before, when I was living in Argentina, my concerns were mainly on American literature and British literature, English literature. So mainly, so I became acquainted with India while I was living here in Brazil, and especially through Lin Mario in 2004. I went to a conference that took place in Hyderabad with one professor from USP and one of my colleagues. And there I had the chance to meet, for example, Homi Baba. He was there. And Meenakshi Mukherjee, she was the author who was organizing the conference. And then I also met Vikram Seth because the other of the novels I worked with in my thesis was A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. And it was the moment when A Suitable Boy had been published, all over the world, that it was a huge success. And Vikram Seth was one of the main writers there. But while I was in that conference, I learned for the first time about Dalit literature. And there were a number of Dalit writers or writers from the Dalit community who had been invited to the conference. And there were a lot of books, some books on sale by Dalit authors. And I became acquainted with these kind of narratives. So there was a book at that moment that had been published into English about Dalit aesthetics, and there was another book of narratives by Dalit writers, as I am telling you. So little by little, I became acquainted with many other writers. So, for example, I started reading this author. Let me show it to you. If I can find it. Well, I don't know if I can find the book now, but there were some women writers from the Dalit community, who were being translated into English. And then when I finished my undergraduate courses here, my PhD here, I did a postdoctoral course with Lin Mario, not with Lin Mario, with a professor from Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. And I work with women Indian writers in the different Indian languages, but translated into English. And there I had the chance once again to become acquainted with many women Indian writers from different parts of India that were talking about their plights, their predicaments, about what was going on with them, with their lives, etc. And I think this again was another very important moment for me to study Indian literature and Indian writers. And the writer I wanted to mention, and I could remember the name, is Bama. So I studied her novels. And of course, then later on, I became acquainted with Mahasveta Devi, because the other big name that was in that conference in Hyderabad in 2004 was Gayatri Spivak. And Gayatri Spivak had just translated Mahasveta Devi's Draupadi, the famous short story, into English. And there was a huge, discussion about that, but why Devi should be known in her native language, in Bengali, or she should be known in English and whatever. So that was the big discussion. And then some years later, I had the chance to go back to India because I was invited to a conference on Gandhi. Because when I was doing my PhD thesis on Arundhati Roy and Vikram Seth, the main topic of my dissertation was the formation of the Indian nation. So the way to independence, the road to independence, the moment of independence, then the years after independence, and the great disappointment that it was my feeling that many Indian writers had with what had happened to India. So I went back to India, and for that I read Gandhi, I read Nehru at that moment, and I had the chance to go to this conference in Delhi. And those were the first two times I had the chance to go to India. And then I joined the Pensando Goa with Professor Elder Garmes,
That's
and
another
I
chapter. That's another chapter. We'll come to it. We'll come to it in a little while.
That's another
It's
chapter. Well,
it's
but thanks to that conference that I met so many big names and important people. And most important of all, I had the chance to meet all these writers, all these people talking about their works, discussing, arguing. Even there was a huge discussion about why a conference about Indian writing was taking place in this, they said, four-star hotel. I don't think it was a four-star, but anyway, so there was a huge discussion. This is not the place to have this conference. It should be in the universe. So I, little by little, I got, more and more inside what Indian literature is. Although, of course, I am always somebody from outside, who is reading from a distance, and this is it. I
but
don't
it's
pretend to be an Indian talking about Indian literature.
that's really fascinating because I mean, in spite of all the distance, you're living virtually half a world away, and in spite of all the distance, you have understood so much of it and gone so deep into it. So it's inspiring to a lot of us and to our students here who can think of what is possible. But how does Indian literature reach Latin America at the moment? Is it through translation mostly? Is translation happening a lot?
You look, more or less, this is one of the differences between Brazil and Argentina. So, Argentina, the language is Spanish. And I think that sometimes many more books get translated into Spanish than into Portuguese. Although Brazil is a huge country, and here we have Compañía das Letras, which is a publishing house, a very important publishing house, and they get a lot of translations and very good translations into Portuguese, wonderful translations. Now, for example, nowadays, you know about the Nobel Prize winner, Gunra. For example, his books have not been translated into Portuguese yet. However, no doubt now that he won the Nobel Prize, they will be translated immediately. And there are very good translators into Portuguese too. This is absolutely. Well, I say this about Spanish, but what I mean is, when I mean that translation of Indian books into Spanish, mainly Spain, more than Argentina. Argentina is not doing very well lately, unfortunately. So I think that many more books get translated into Spain. And here in Brazil, little by little, everything gets into Portuguese. Yes. And there are many people who are acquainted, at least with the most famous Indian writers. Or with some writers who are somehow connected to India, like, for example, Naipaul, who, of course, he's not Indian, but he comes from Indian descent, although he has so much criticized India, etc.
So, doctor, to shift from India and Argentina to Brazil and Goa, Pensando Goa, tell us about that.
Well, I think that Pensando Goa is a very important project, that is led by Professor Elder Garmes. Elder Garmes, as everybody knows, he's from the area of literatures in Portuguese. And he knows that in Goa there is a huge library. This is why his project is called Thinking Goa, a singular library in the Portuguese language. And his idea is that all these narratives in the Portuguese language in Goa, they deserve to be studied, because there are some very wonderful writers in Goa. Like everybody knows, yes, you have Vimala Devi, Maria Elsa da Rocha, Leopoldo da Rocha, Lakshman Rao Sardesai, and so many other wonderful writers, and so this is how the project started. And his idea was, first of all, to make somehow the Brazilian public acquainted with all these wonderful books which were written in Goa during the colonial times and after colonial times, and that it was a great pity that these authors should be limited to a very small public. So a lot more people, that was his idea, should know, for example, Dulce and Jacob, yes, Os Brahmanes, or Vimala Devi, So this was at the core of the project Pensando Goa, and his idea was to bring Pensando Goa into, I mean, Goan literature into the mainstream of other literary traditions in the Portuguese language around the world. So much so that last year, Elder offered a course at São Paulo University, not last year, last semester, a course at Universidade de São Paulo about writers in the Portuguese languages from all over the world. And of course, he included a module on Goan authors. And Paul Velho Castro participated in this course. But this was especially the main idea of the Pensando Goa project. And I think that he actually succeeded in the objective of his project, because he was working, and he continues working, goes on working with many Goan scholars from Portugal, and from Goa, of course, definitely, and from the United States and from England. So people that in different manners, different approaches, different ways are very much interested in wonderful Goan literature. And of course, once we got to Goa and we became so much inside this Portuguese Goan literature in Portuguese, definitely we became acquainted with many other writers, not only in English, but also in Konkani and Marathi. So little by little, I started doing that. I found out that there were so many excellent writers. Not only in English. And in fact, I was invited to participate in the project because I come from English studies. But when I went to Goa and I started reading all the other authors, I fell in love with the writers who write in Portuguese. And I discovered wonderful narratives in Konkani and other narratives in Marathi. And for that, I think all the books by Fundação Oriente, they have been very important. Look, I have all of them here because I have been working, writing a paper. So I have all my books from Fundación Oriente here. I have the full collection. And of
The short stories that have got translated into.
Yes, all the short stories, and some of the books are wonderful. The selections are very interesting, the different authors from the different communities. And also, one of the interesting things about this collection is to see how the subject matters of the short stories have been changing through the years, taking into account what was going on in Goa or the different things that were going during, along the time. So the subject matter has been changing in a very interesting manner. So what I have been doing also is reading all the short stories, one book after the other, to see the connection of the relationship among authors and topics, subject matters, different subjects of interest. So this has been very interesting to me. I'm very sorry I don't speak Konkani, because I know that there are some absolutely wonderful works written in Konkani that I would very much like to read. And of course, what I have to point out, that Paul Melio Castro has been doing a wonderful work through his translation of some Goan authors in Portuguese into English, because in this way, many of these authors, are becoming known to Goans who today do not speak Portuguese. And this is such a treasure that it is a real pity that Goans shouldn't be acquainted with these authors. And then there are other writers that I am very much interested in. I don't know, Alito Siqueira. He had this project, wonderful project called HaveCon, okay, that they had their blog, and now they have published a book with all the narratives. And he was working with many former students, from Goa University, and they brought to Hong Kong a different kind of narratives, but also have to do, with Goan life and with Goan literature in a way, because maybe they are not exactly short stories; they are more like life narratives. But these life narratives, they bring into the literary scene a different image of Goa, other experiences of the Goan community that come in a way to contest or to complement, the many other writers who write in all the different languages. So I think that the Goan literary scenario is a very complex literary scenario. And if all these literary narratives and literary styles and genres and theories and languages converse among themselves, they also converse with the narratives from the rest of India. Absolutely.
That's very interesting, Doctor, what you're saying, because of course I've been following Pensando for quite some time. I've been on your tail for quite some time. I've been recording some of your programs and your audio recordings and all those kind of things. And it's both amazing and embarrassing that probably Goan writing in Portuguese today is better understood in Brazil, maybe Portugal also, England, US, rather than in Goa itself. But of course, that's our failing. That reflects on us, not on y'all. In terms of Goan translations, I know you've always been pushing for more translations. What's your suggestion on this? Because you all come from a multilingual society. We also. How do we cope with it?
Look, really, I don't know. I know that there are many translators. There are different translators for different authors. One of the translators that I am most acquainted with is Paul Melu Castro, and all his translations are absolutely wonderful, because he knows, these authors in detail, and he has this wonderful command of course, of the English language. He's a native speaker of English and of Portuguese, so his translations are a treasure. So he has now translated a Monsoon by Vimala Devi, and his translation into English, really, it is worth reading. I think all Goans should read this book, because the way in which he brings to life Vimala Devi is absolutely marvelous. And then he has the two books that he published with you, the two books of short stories. Here I have it, the famous Lengthening Shadows, the two volumes. So these two volumes are absolutely marvelous, because what does he do? He comments first in the introduction about some of the most important India Goan writers in Portuguese, and then he chooses some of their short stories that he translates into English. So if you want to become acquainted, with Goan literature in the Portuguese language, and unfortunately you don't read Portuguese or you read little Portuguese, this is a good place to start. This is a book that has been published by you, and it is really a treasure.
Sorry, Paul has also been having problems there because the Goan Portuguese has elements of Konkani wedded into it. So he has been taking all this trouble to, point number one, to find this actual meaning of what the writers meant, and he's been taking a lot of trouble by asking people locally and all. I know that. The second point is that also he has had to dig up these stories from all the newspaper archives, because there was
Yes.
this tradition of short stories getting widely published in colonial times in newspapers, which has since stopped, and people have forgotten these newspapers, and they are not easily accessible, and he has brought it all together under one roof. So I just thought of mentioning that also. But in terms of making more translations happen, Dr. Cielo, what are you looking at from Konkani, Marathi, and maybe English also? What is your suggestion? Because we are a small society, it's a small market, so there are difficulties in getting it through. But still, I think you could tell us what people in your part of the world might be wanting to read, and how it could be got across.
Well, I will tell you what they are doing in the place, in the school where I teach. So, for example, what happens with this Nobel Prize winner? So, there are very few translations. I think there are no translations of the Nobel Prize winner, the latest one, into Portuguese. So two professors from the translation studies department, they suggested that their students, they start working on the translations of at least some of his short stories. So maybe this is something that could be done, I don't know, in Goa University. So, for example, in the departments of Marathi or the departments of Konkani, so that they start working on translations there in college, so this might be a very interesting, way to start. I don't know, this is just a suggestion. Look, I am not a translator myself, so I wouldn't know, but I think that this is a way of working, and this is something that I have done, for example, in this university where I work. Many times the level of English of our students is not that high. However, we work with texts in English. And how do we do that? So, some of my lessons are not only literature classes, but also they have a little bit of translation, because I work with my students on how to read those texts. So maybe the same should happen there in Goa University, starting from undergraduate level and then moving on. So I don't know. So this is just one way of working. I don't know. Maybe Paul Meli Castro has more ideas, but I always say that he has been doing such a wonderful work. And I think that this book, Lengthening Shadows, it should sell in the supermarkets, because everybody should read that book, because everybody should be acquainted with all those wonderful writers, and also with Monsoon, by Vimala Devi. And I hope Paul does the same with many other writers. And also, there is another book, let me see if I have it here, that was published by Dave Smith. I think this one. Avanti Goesis Avanti.
Yeah.
So this is wonderful, and also D.A. Smith. He has a translation of Vimala Devi's poems, from Surya, which is also a wonderful translation. He translated into English. So I think all this work, all these books, they are worth reading, worth studying. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Delfin Correa da Silva is already doing that, because in his wonderful course in Portuguese in Goa University, he has different subjects on Goan literature. So, and the students, they are learning, they are reading from the original in Portuguese. There is another Goan author, that is Beatriz, what's her name, Beatriz Ataide Lobo, that she used to publish the short stories in the different journals. And what Paul did, together with one of Beatriz's nieces who lives now in Mozambique, they collected all the stories by Beatriz published in the different newspapers in Goa. You know, en A Vida, in Heraldo, and there is a document, a PhD with all these stories. So maybe a transcription could be made, all the stories could be put together, and a book could be published with all those wonderful narratives. So what I say is that you there in Goa have such a literary treasure, but I know that many people are working on them. For example, with the post translation of Monsoon. So there are some other people from some other areas that are reading, her work at present, and no doubt they will start reading this book, as I know one person has done. But I don't want to spoil it because she has written a very nice article that will be published in a journal, comparing, Vimala Devi with other writers from other walks of society, from Goa. So, in my opinion, this is what should be done.
Doctor, I
This is
know
what
it's
I
early in the
consider.
morning. It's early in the morning in Brazil and in Sao Paulo. And Sao Paulo is the Bombay of Brazil, if we can call it, the commercial capital. And you have a busy day ahead. But one last question. I don't want to keep you for too long. One last question. Do you think that literature and language can play a link between such disparate parts of the world as India and Brazil, Goa and Sao Paulo, even India and Argentina?
No doubt. I am absolutely sure of that. And I think that literature has been doing that forever. Well, the English knew that. And this is why they took their own literature, to all the corners of the world where they had colonies. But what happened with those different people living in the different colonies? They appropriated, the language and the literary styles, the way of telling stories, and they started telling their own stories about their own countries, about their own cultures. And this is the way in which many other literatures around the world were created into the English language. So today we don't teach English studies any longer, but we teach literatures in English, not only here in Brazil, but in other parts of the world. And yes, literary narratives are windows, as somebody has said, to the world. Only, as Paul Melo Castro has argued, what kind of windows? Big windows, small windows? What is the perspective of those windows? But absolutely, yes, they establish a link. And mainly in many countries that were colonies, that went through the colonial experience, because these literatures many times took the role, of a history. So I think, yes, absolutely. I believe in that. Building bridges. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's harmonious. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that the windows are necessarily big, as Paul would say, but I say that it's a way of connecting, it's a way of establishing a web around the world. And I do think that, yes, such connection exists, definitely.
Doctor, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And not only because Argentinians and Brazilians speak as fast as we Indians do, but but also I enjoy the points you make. And once I actually grabbed you and took you into one of our English classes, and the students enjoyed you being there. We are so grateful for all you do and for building the links and for using your English language skills. And I hope we can also have some more discussions on Pensando and other projects so that
Sure.
we know each other more and we can share our interest. Thank you so much for being here this morning and for taking your time and planning this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. You do so much for all of us, for
No,
Goan
I
literature.
enjoy. I enjoy that. That's no, I'll cut it here, but I'm really grateful to all of you. Thank you. Bye.
We are grateful to you.